Welcome to our 80th podcast for Thanks for Your Service. Our focus is on historical topics relating to the Australian military. You can find us on Facebook, X and YouTube. Just search for Thanks for Your Service. Our website is www.thanksforyourservice.net, and you can also email us at info@thanksforyourservice.net. Anzac Day 2025 marks the 110th anniversary of the commemoration of the landing at Gallipoli. When thinking of places linked to the Gallipoli Campaign, you may have heard of places such as Egypt and Lemnos. However, you may not have heard of Imbros. In today's podcast, Jim Claven tells us about the importance of the island of Imbros to the campaign. Joining us on the line from Melbourne is Jim Claven, Secretary of the Lemnos Gallipoli Commemorative Committee and historian and curator and author. Jim, thanks again for joining us today.
Thank you, David.
Now, the last time we spoke was for our 74th podcast, where we learn about the documentary titled Anzac, the Greek Chapter. Can you fill us in, please, on what's happened since we last spoke to you in August 2024?
Well, we've had more community screenings, as they call it. So these are public screenings in Canberra, Sydney, and another location in Melbourne. We're also, it's going to be in May, it's going to be in Adelaide. But what we're really happy about is that during the Anzac celebrations in Greece, the Australian Embassy is hosting a screening of the documentary at the Athens War Museum. And they've got a big auditorium, so we're pretty happy with that. And also it'll be shown later on in May at Kalamata and at Cardamilli to coincide with the placement of two new plaques, which I've organised to be made to commemorate two particular World War II Greek campaign events. So there's a bit of a tour of the film. So we're pretty glad, and it's a subtitled version now. We've got subtitles to it. So, and obviously we'll have more screenings as we get events and locations that want to have it.
So it's April 2025. So this month marks the 110th anniversary of the landing at Gallipoli, and many of our listeners may have heard of the island of Lemnos and the important role it played during the campaign. But there was another island that also played a vital role, and that is Imbros. Where is it?
Well, Imbros lies closer to the northeast of Lemnos, and it's closer to the Gallipoli Peninsula. It's very, very close. You can see Gallipoli Peninsula quite clearly from the eastern shores of it. The other island also was Tenedos, smaller, and that was to the south, and that was opposite the southern coast, Asiatic coast, opposite the peninsula. But Imbros was very close, and that was the Allied headquarters for the Gallipoli campaign for most of the campaign.
And apart from Allied headquarters, what other role did it play during the Gallipoli campaign?
Yeah, so I'll just explain a bit of why I got interested in it. Obviously, I've written a book about the Lemnos' role, and it's had a lot of people would know about that now. It was a major harbour, biggest harbour in the Eastern Mediterranean. It was a staging post, hospitals, and all the like. Now, that was a bit further from the peninsula, and it was safer, in terms of the protected harbour and the like. But what happened was, originally when the campaign started, the Allied headquarters were actually planned to be on the peninsula itself, and they were there, but on a warship. But of course, campaign didn't go as planned, and the headquarters were moved to Imbros, which was occupied by the Allies, along with Lemnos and Tenedos, and General Hamilton had his headquarters there, based on the shores of Kephalos Bay, which was a large bay on the eastern side of Imbros. Imbros is quite a large island, sort of rectangular island, I suppose you want to say it, with mountains and the like. That was used because it had easy access to the peninsula relatively quickly, and the harbour wasn't as good as Lemnos because it wasn't as protected. It was basically like a U shape with the island, on one side and an arm going up. But what they did was they sunk some warships. They sunk some ships in the harbour front to sort of create a sort of closer neck to protect it. But I suppose in terms of the role of the island, it starts off. It's also, when the troops left Lemnos to go to Gallipoli, they sort of assembled in ships off the Imbros coast, and then they sort of disembarked into the landing craft and made their way towards Gallipoli. So it was important sheltering for that. And then, as I said before, the Allied headquarters were based there. But then increasingly, as the campaign wore on and things, the front didn't occur wasn't as successful as they planned. It became had some rest camps were there, had some hospital facilities, not as major as Lemnos, had some for sort of minor injuries and illnesses, but it also had it was a major air base. Not only did it have sort of landcraft, it also had seaplanes, it had balloons, observation balloons, and also a Zeppelin was based there. So it was a major air base for most of the time of the campaign, and that they were used for either bombing or for observations. And it was also a supply base. And how it was important for supplies, a major unit, the Australian bakeries. Now, you don't usually read about these sort of supply bases, but as many people would know, Gallipoli, most of the deaths, most of the sickness and illness was a result of dysentery and food and the like. And one of the things they wanted to do was improve the quality of food, and part of that was getting fresh bread. So an Australian bakery unit was sent there, and that was some hundreds of bakers and their assistants and like, and they provided tens of thousands of loaves to the peninsula. It ended up, they were so efficient at these sort of ground bakeries that they ended up being in charge of all the bakeries supplying the troops. So there were, some of the photos are quite interesting. There's massive the security for the bread because people were stealing it and stuff. So there's lots of photographs of these guys, and as I discovered, they played a really important role. There's actually someone did their PhD on the role of the bakeries in Imbros. So there's sort of some famous the man in charge of it was a famous Adelaide chef, and he was so the actual unit was made up of very experienced bakers and like. So that was one thing. But I think the major role was these aircraft, and also as rest camps. So it was used as rest camps for troops coming off the peninsula for a short period of time. But also it was also a staging post for the August offensives. A lot of famous Australians came there. Shout, the guy that won a VC, he was there. A number of other ones. The other thing was that the Allied journalists, including Charles Bean, who everyone would know, who became the official historian of the campaign, but he was the official war correspondent. He was based on Imbros, just in a building just up from Kefalos Bay. And they occupied a house which they renamed the Villa Pericles in allusion to their classical studies and the like. And they were based there because I think, as you're probably aware, when Hamilton and the British command got a bit worried about these journalists writing about the campaign and sort of raining on their parade, I suppose, or talking about the difficulties of the campaign, including Ashmead Bartlett, who was the famous British historian, who's he's really the author of what we call the Murdoch letter, because he was the one that gave the information to Murdoch. So what happened was they were sort of banned from the peninsula. Bean used to try and get over the peninsula, and he was there for times, but basically they were based on Imbros. There's lots of photographs of them on Imbros, the different journalists on donkeys and like. But the other thing they did with all these troops that were based there, they also travelled around the island, hiring donkeys like they did on Lemnos, experiencing the food, writing about it, the conditions, and the likes. That's another mode of interaction. I should say as well, with the Allied headquarters, what I discovered was that Australian troops were brought from the peninsula to provide a guard. So there's a number, you can't remember off the top of my head the battalions, but I've actually got names of the officers that were in charge of that. So the Allied command on Gallipoli on Imbros was guarded by Australian troops for a period. There's photographs of them. So for all those reasons, David, the role of Imbros, which has basically been, you think Lemnos was forgotten for a while. Imbros has been sort of ignored, even though it actually had quite an important role.
It has, hasn't it? I was going to make that comment in terms, or ask the question, is that obviously people have heard of the Gallipoli Campaign. the training in Egypt, etc. They've heard of Lemnos, the nurses on Lemnos, the harbour. But why haven't people heard about Imbros? And it was the Allied headquarters was actually based there.
No, it was the location of the first purpose-built aircraft carrier. So the HMS Ark Royal, the first iteration of the Ark Royal, which became a famous name for aircraft carriers, was on Imbros. You know, so you think, you know, this is the first time it's been. There was a Zeppelin that was there was a big Zeppelin hangar. So the interesting thing about the aircraft, and this I'll get to one of the so. A number of years ago, I was going to Gallipoli for the centenary in 2015, and I went to, not for the centenary, but I went to the centenary on Lemnos, but I went via Gallipoli. And I went to Imbros at the same time, and I was sort of visiting, you know, doing some field research. And it was just, the thing that got me was, you know, the sort of, the locations, you know, a bit like Lemnos, it hasn't been developed. So you can look at these photographs that were there from the time, archival photographs. You can envisage, you know, you can clearly see where things were. But there's very few photographs. There's a few photographs in the Australian War Memorial, and I was sort of bedeviled by this because I thought, well, if they're there for a long period of time, other people would have taken photographs. And what I discovered was that there's a society in England, which is the First World War Aviation Society. And it's a long story, but I got in contact with them via the internet because I seen a photograph of the cemetery that was on Imbros. And I didn't know there was a cemetery there because there's no cemetery listed in the Commonwealth War Graves. So long story short, I see this photograph. They say it's taken by this guy. It turns out there was one of the aviation photographers who was based on Imbros, took hundreds of photographs of, he was taking photographs of the Gallipoli Peninsula, but he took lots of photographs of the island. He had a photographic developing, you know, room. He took photos of the village, took photos of all the sort of establishments. He took photos of Lesbos, you know, Lemnos, all these sort of places. Took photos of the bloody airship and all the stuff. And what happened was they, for the exchange of my book, Lemnos Gallipoli Revealed, they provided me with digital images of these photographs. And they were just amazing. Without them, I mean, I don't think I wouldn't have been able to put together the exhibition because they sort of document so much. Marrying them with the few photographs in the Imperial War Museum and also the Australian War Memorial, it created quite a group of photographs, as well as there's a number of drawings and paintings of Imbros that were done by some British sailors, some by New Zealand soldiers, and you put them together and you got quite a visual record of what was going on, especially the shipping and the aircraft and the valleys and the like. So there is quite an archive there, but it wasn't readily available, and that's why if I can go forward to the exhibition. So as you know, I'd written a bit about Lemnos. I'd been over there, been involved with our committee, and there's actually an Imbros Society in Melbourne, and what they are is they're the sort of people that they're Hellenic background people, heritage people who lived on Imbros, who then came to Australia, and their children. And they were on the island until the 60s and 70s. And they approached me because they said, we've heard about Lemnos, but what about, I'd written an article about being on Imbros, and they asked me, is it possible to do an exhibition of photographs? And I thought, I wasn't too sure. And I thought, oh, is there enough? And anyway, we ended up, we sort of got some funding and put together an exhibition, a 20-panel, quite large exhibition with text and the photographs, and then also produced a book of the exhibition, which is basically the exhibition with a bit more elaboration on the text. And that sort of, so it's called From Imbros Over the Sea. I took that title because it was a British soldier, famous. He was one of the sort of World War I war poets who was based on Imbros, and he wrote this beautiful poem with these classical allusions because he was on Imbros, staying in a hotel there, and he wrote saying that he didn't want to go back to the peninsula, but he felt compelled to do so because of his other, his colleagues, his comrades that were there, and he was appealing to Achilles to stand with him, and of course, any Helene or some of the sort of classical history, they're beautiful words, and they're sort of about, let's give me strength, stand Achilles with me in the trench. So from Imbros over the sea. So anyway, as a result of all that, I managed to put together this exhibition and for an event in Melbourne.
Let's expand on the exhibition. Where has it been? Where is it planned to be? And it's still being held now. Is that correct?
Yeah, so the way we did it was I had done an exhibition about Lemnos a while ago, and that was like framed, photographs, and we would talk. What we decided, had a different way of doing it. These larger panels. They've got strips of photographs, like oval photographs, top and the bottom with text in the middle, and they're on this form board, which is really light. And you can either, you can put it on an easel, you can attach it to a wall, you can hang it, whatever you want to do. You can use blue tack. So we thought this is really simple. We'll get these, and then what we'll do is, if people want to display it in other states or even overseas, we can just we can produce them here and get them mailed to them. They're really light, so it's about $500 for the set of them, the 20 of them. So they've been displayed already in Sydney and in Melbourne, a number of locations in Melbourne and in Brisbane. So, but what we did was Canberra, when we had the film of the Anzac, the Greek chapter. That coincided with having the display as well, so that went well. It was a World War I, World War II sort of Hellenic connection to Anzac across both world wars. But we're hoping to get it do a version of to show in Turkey, like on Imbros. So, but anyway, the exhibition it has a good effect because you see them all immediately, all the photographs. You can read the text or you just can ignore it and look at the photographs. But it tells a story it's got various themes, the aircraft, it's got discovering the island, it's got the harbour. There's a terrible storm on the island, a lot of things happened there. There were prisoners of war on it. It talks about the cemeteries. Maybe I'll talk to you about the cemeteries because that's an interesting thing. I think we were talking about that earlier, or we're communicating about it. So there's this curious photograph of a soldier a burial on the island. Now, there's no Commonwealth War graves has no reference to Imbros having a cemetery, or none that I'd seen. So I had none that I'd located. So through this photographer, who British air photographer, he took photographs of the cemetery, 2 photographs with the sort of headstones or the crosses that they did at the time with names on them, and then he also had a burial. So he had like a sort of naval officers and soldiers marching up, to as part of a burial party. And where is this? Because I've been there, and I didn't see it when I was over there. Where is this? Where is this location? Because what happened? What when I got some more information from the Commonwealth War graves. It was on the island, and also there were some burials there made towards the end of the war, 1918, when if you remember the 2 German warships that had been rebadged as Ottoman warships, they tried to. Off the top of my head, I can't remember the name of them at the moment, but they tried to exit the Dardanelles. They were sort of stuck up in Constantinople, and there was a battle. They engaged the British fleet. They sunk a British ship, but they were badly damaged, and they just went back, into the Dardanelles. Anyway, there was burials done then as well. But after the war, all the bodies were exhumed, and they were buried at Lancashire Landing Cemetery on the peninsula. But I was interested in this. Well, there was a cemetery there. So how many were buried? It's hard to get the sort of trying to retro count back and get the numbers of people there. But there was a couple of Australians buried there, at least 2. One was a pilot. Well, what I mean by Australian, his parents were Australian. He was brought up in England, and he was a pilot. He was killed. There's an Australian connection, and there was one Australian soldier. I can't remember off the top of my head, but they were then both relocated to Lancashire Landing. So it was a fully, it was a full base. It had, rest camps, headquarters, air stuff, sea. One of the things I discovered, which is very interesting, is an Australian connection, was that, and I wrote an article about this, there was the governor of Victoria, was a guy called Lord Brassey, and him and his wife, they were in Australia before the First World War. He was quite connected with the Navy. Anyway, when he returned to England after his time as a governor, when the Gallipoli Campaign broke out, he wanted to help. Well, he had a a yacht, like a large yacht. He had it retrofitted as a hospital thing for officers, right? And he sailed it, to the Dardanelles. I don't know if he had permission at the beginning, but he arrives at Imbros, right? And this is referred to in General Hamilton's diary. And also this guy went back to England and wrote, and he did a bit of a Murdoch letter. He complained about, the lack of organisation, the bad planning, and it really embarrassed Hamilton, as same sort of thing. But because he arrived there, they stayed at the Kefalos Bay. This is during the campaign. They sailed this yacht in. It's all been refurbished, but had a library which included Homer. Isn't that amazing? Yeah. It wasn't used as a hospital ship in Imbros. It ended up going to Egypt, and it was used there as a hospital ship for some officers, not a hospital ship, more like a rehabilitation, rest. What a lovely way to rest, recuperate. You got a library on it. Anyway, but Hamilton complained because he's Lord Brassey and he's the governor. His wife was a suffragette. So these are sort of agitational people with connections in London. So he's wandering around the island talking to, the hospital people, officers, really pissing Hamilton off. Hamilton complains that he's been talking to, too many people. I want to get rid of him because he's going to, So eventually Brassey leaves, but Brassey goes back, and there is some evidence that he sort of communicated to networks about how the campaign was a schmozzle, and no doubt that contributed to all that noise that saw Hamilton relieved and Munro sent out. So that was it. That's the connection to Victoria and Australia. So that was one of those little. The other thing I discovered was that there was these thing called the communications at Gallipoli, and to the command outside was through these. They had these cables, communications cables under the water, and they had the Eastern Telegraphic Cable Company, which is this is a company before the war, so it was an English-based company which laid cables throughout the Eastern Mediterranean. And from Constantinople to Athens, or around the islands. Anyway, of course, when the Allies arrived, first thing to do was cut all the cables to Constantinople. So they did that on Lemnos. But the company sent out a ship, and all the men on the ship were all the sort of technical engineers. They were deemed officers in the Naval Reserve, and they were sailing around Imbros, Lemnos, Gallipoli, fixing up cables, laying new ones. Because all these warships are sailing between the peninsula, and they're dragging their bloody anchors and, snapping the cables. So they're fixing them all the time. Well, they spent a lot of time. They spent time in Imbros, and they recruited their crews locally. So there were Greek fishermen on the sailors on these ships. There was two of them, two cable laying ships, and they were sailing quite close to the Gallipoli Peninsula. And they're coming to Imbros. They were shelled. The Ottoman forces would shell them. There's a famous instance where they're getting shelled, and one of the commanders kept the diary. I found his diary. He sort of was worried that they're going to get hit, so they move away from the peninsula. And that as they do it, a shell hits one of the masts, and splinters are all over the ship, and it hits one of the Greek sailors who has been fishing. You imagine it. This is the Gallipoli campaign. This guy's fishing off the harbour to catch some fish, and he gets injured with it. So I just think of this. What's going on in the peninsula. There's all these various things, including guys fishing off the peninsula. So I managed to find in the National Archives in London, there was the what do you call it? It was the it's like the manifest of all the sailors that are on this ship, on these cable laying ships. I don't know. Anyway, and for the sailors, it has where they were recruited from, the Greek islands, and they've got their names. So you found some of them are from Tenedos. There's no one recruited from Imbros, but a lot of them are from Malta and different areas, but they're Greek surnames. So, I sort of pondered, when these ships lay at anchor and came ashore on Imbros, you got these Greek sailors with these British engineers, were they communicating with the locals? Were they buying bread and buying stuff, So, I think, as we talked before, a real interest I have is in the social interaction between the locals and these military people. And that's a really interesting thing when you've got these Greek sailors who obviously could speak English, otherwise how would they have communicated with them? And they're going to Imbros, and I should say as well, Imbros, like Lemnos, was only sort of joined to Greece in 1912. So very much a Ottoman, economy, Ottoman island, and then liberated, as you might say, or joined to Greece, and so. It would have been interesting. They're in a process of transition. Having said, in terms of the island itself, the other thing is that there are a number of accounts in Australian war diaries of their visits to Imbros, and there's an officer. He also did the same for Lemnos, where when he arrived, he talks about the villages. He talks about the Greek population, or the Greek Orthodox population, and the Ottoman, the Muslim population, and it was very small. On Imbros, it was probably 98% Greek Orthodox. Very small number of Ottomans, basically officials, sort of government representatives, municipality, and they basically left when the Greeks arrived. They were repatriated to the mainland. There were more Ottoman officials and also villagers. There were settlers on Lemnos, but Imbros seems to have been, predominantly a Greek island, sort of Greek heritage island sort of thing. So
part of your research into the campaign at Imbros, you've been to the island. What remnants are there today that may still exist of the campaign?
So as I was saying before, in terms of the environment, it hasn't been overly developed, the island. So if you go to the eastern side, so you go to the villages around Kephalos Bay and the vistas there, they're very, very evocative of what soldiers wrote about. And there's also a place called Gallipoli, which is called Castro at the time. That's on the north. Soldiers and sailors would go there and they go to swim and like that. That has a Charles Bean went there and he took photographs of a ruined castle. The ruined castle is exactly the same, hasn't collapsed. If you look at it, this thing is exposed to the winds from the Dardanelles. It's half destroyed, from its warfare in the Middle Ages. It's still standing exactly the same. If you see the photographs, you're amazed this thing hasn't toppled over just from the wind. So that's still there. And so there are a number of that in particular, but there are a number of vistas you can see exactly what was there before. In terms of, obviously, the cemetery's not there anymore. There are, in terms of the sort of infrastructure, it was basically, a lot of it was temporary. It wasn't like Lemnos. So what you've got is, I think the Villa Pericles, some of that remains, but not. I think it sort of was that's been. It was. I think it was ended up being. It sort of collapsed and was used as a shelter for sheep and the like. But you can certainly see, where the air base was. Where the seaplane base was. You can see where the ships were sunk to protect the harbour. They were then, believe it or not, they were then refloated and used again. They sunk them and refloated them. You think, so they weren't leaving them, and there isn't the cemetery, which would be the thing that would be to look at. The villages, the villages where people visited, like it's called. There was Imbros town, or it was called Imbros town by the Turkish authorities after 22, but it was called Panagia. But all these towns are in the same place, so that's where the main church is. There are Allied soldiers buried in that church, in the church grounds. That's one thing I haven't been able to follow up, but yeah. So the Kalakoi, Panagia, Aya Theodoro, all these villages, they're referred to in a lot of British soldiers' diaries, as well as Australian references there was a West Australian soldier who wrote home. He saw himself as a bit of a writer, so he wrote long letters that were published in the Western Australian newspaper, and he talked about visiting churches and wandering around and leaving gifts in the chapels and stuff like this. So there's quite a so in terms of if you're saying about could you do a trail, could you visit the places, you certainly can, because if you're armed with the archival photographs, you can see exactly where things were. because there hasn't been like a hotel built in the middle of it, or there hasn't been some sort of, petrochemical plant built or something. It's quite, it's basically a sort of what you say, medium sort of tourist destination for the Turkish population and also people from Europe. And as I said before, there's probably the Greek population there, the Greek Orthodox population has actually increased in recent years. So maybe if you said 10 years ago, or it was about 200 in winter, now it's 700. Right? So during the Greek financial crisis, people moved to Imbros. This is Greeks from Greece with a connection to the island that have sort of access to Turkish citizenship. They moved back to the island. Schools have reopened because schools at various times have shut, but there's primary schools now. There's this sort of thing. Last year I went to attend in Greece. There's a major fundraiser. 5,000 people attending at a concert in Athens. All the money going to the schools on Imbros. So there's an interest, and the authorities on the island. I mean, it's quite harmonious on the island now. The Turkish authorities on the island, municipality, are really keen to encourage people to come and visit and things like that. There are restrictions about owning property and these sort of things, but yeah. So sort of maybe circumstances are right. You could see a bit of a, but I think to do with the Gallipoli story, there's a real opportunity for the island and all of its residents to sort of, benefit, and also to sort of, I suppose what you're saying, keep the island alive by connecting it, commemorating its role in the Gallipoli campaign. So we always have these events, Anzac Day, always the Anzac Cove, and they do a tour and you visit all the sites that you have for the official tours, but there's nothing about Imbros. You could certainly do an add-on. The Imbros itself could do after the Gallipoli events, have a series of events, services on the island, sensitive, appropriate, the same as doing the Gallipoli Peninsula, which would benefit everyone that lives there. So that's sort of the message that the Imbrian society that I'm part of, people, they go back regularly. We're trying to have sort of dialogue with the municipality, because it's just an opportunity for them, but also it's an opportunity to remember this part of the Gallipoli campaign. It's not remembered, and as I say, you do a tour of Gallipoli and you go to Gallipoli, then you go to Troy. Well, that site they do has got nothing to do with
exactly.
Gallipoli. The good thing was, I think it was a couple of years ago, the Gallipoli Association in England, which I'm a member of, some of their people visited Imbros. They went there to do this sort of thing. So there's sort of like a bit of there's a bit of an increased interest, and who knows, maybe in the next few years, we might see sort of a bit more, and maybe some commemoration where things were, piers and the like, and maybe even you could have where the cemetery was. There's no reason why you couldn't have a marker, because that site was a grave site. There's no bones in there, but it was a grave site. People were interred there. So and
if any of our listeners wants to find out more about Imbros and its role in the Gallipoli campaign, in 2023 you published a book titled From Imbros Over the Sea, Imbros and Gallipoli Revealed, a pictorial and historical overview and exhibition guide. Where can people grab a copy of the book?
Well, they could communicate with me, and I can pass it on to the Imbrian Society. I wrote the book for them. So that my email is jimclaven@yahoo.com.au, JIMCLAVEN@yahoo.com.au, and I'm happy to pass it on. So and it includes every photograph that's in the exhibition, and So and it's I just hope more people visit the island to see what there's an Australian connection there, that's been forgotten. The other thing I meant to say, Dave, I forgot one thing, is that after the Gallipoli campaign, one of the most important volumes that was produced was called the Anzac book, and that was written. It was compiled from contributions that Charles Bean obtained from soldiers on the peninsula. He compiled it on Imbros. He compiled the book there. So I think, isn't that amazing? This book that was a bestseller, like veterans families, it was a sort of connection with them with the campaign. It was a bestseller. It was reprinted in the centenary. That was compiled on the island, with Bean and his assistant. So that was something. I mean, the Imbrians that I've talked to, they're not aware of the Anzac book, but a lot of Australians are. But you say this brings together, it's a really important volume that has a connection between Aussie Australians and the island. So.
And Jim, I've got a copy. So straight after this interview, I'm going to go jump and grab it. And look, it's always a pleasure talking to you. Thank you so much for your time. That's the podcast for today. We're keen to hear your feedback by leaving a review on your podcast app. Your reviews helps new listeners find our podcast. If you have any special requests or suggestions for our podcast, please get in touch. And you can help support this podcast via Patreon or Buy Me a Coffee. The links are on our website and Facebook page, and your support helps us with the production of this podcast. Do you have a relative who has served in the Australian military? Our family military history research packages sources records to better understand the service and experience of those who've served. You can find out more information on our website. Thanks for listening, and thanks for your service.